Hello, Duke and North Carolina fans. Welcome back in to another episode of the Duke Blue Devils and the North Carolina Insider Podcast. I am your host of the Duke Blue Devils Insider Podcast, Hugh Strain, joined by UNC on SI Tar Heels host and beat writer Logan Lazarchik. Here going over some Duke basketball and North Carolina basketball off seasons, some expectations heading into the year, comparing and contrasting both squads for two programs that sure are arch rivals, but are in pretty different realms of the college basketball world right now, pretty different tiers heading into the season, fairly different expectations. Duke is obviously riding high in the ACC, 36-2 in league play over the last two seasons, back-to-back ACC regular season and tournament titles. Carolina, on the other hand, a new head coach, brand new roster, a lot of change expected over in Chapel Hill. Logan, I'll bring it over to you here. Obviously, brand new head coach. North Carolina goes outside of its family to hire it. But to me, at least, a fairly successful offseason haul for Michael Malone in his first with the Tar Heels. I think there was a lot of talent. I'm just very curious how it fits, but certainly some promise in Chapel Hill heading into the year, in my opinion.
Yeah, and as you said, both these programs in polar opposite, landscapes. I think Duke, obviously, they're competing for a national championship. North Carolina is just trying to try and find their footing in the NCAA tournament. But as you said, I've been impressed with how North Carolina has gone about through this offseason. Again, they hired Michael Malone. He entered the program while the transfer portal window was open. And despite that, they were still able to compile a pretty intriguing roster and one that should be much better in a much better spot compared to last season. And I do think Michael Malone coming in as the head coach, I do think that's a major upgrade in compared to what they've had over the last 5 years with Hubert Davis. So again, I'm kind of curious of what, your perspective of Duke is. And I kind of wanted to ask you, does this kind of feel like, a Final Four or bust for Duke in 2026?
I think it's tough to go into a season saying Final Four or bust. To me, this is the most championship ready roster that John Shire has had since he's taken over at Duke in 2022. I like the continuity. I mean, 4 of Duke's top 6 scorers are back. I love the portal gets with Blackwell and Drew Sharnowski from Belmont. I think they're both going to be really impactful. And then you kind of supplement that with one of the top high school recruiting classes in the country heading into the year. And it's kind of where UNC and Duke are kind of on polar opposites heading into the years. Duke has the continuity, which isn't necessarily a regular thing for the Blue Devils over the last several years. I mean, in 7 of the last 9 years, Duke's leading scorer has been a freshman. And I'm very high on John Blackwell. I've talked about it on the Duke Blue Devils Insider Podcast all offseason. I think he's going to be a top 5 to 7 scorer in the entire sport this year. But Duke has the continuity. 3 starters from last year are back. 4 of the top 6 scorers are back. As you can expect with a head coaching change, Michael Malone doesn't have a lot of that. But heading into the year, I'm curious about the backcourt. That's kind of where my questions arise. I'm a big fan of Neokas Abdalas. I think him as more of a passer is going to excel at the 3 spot. But Matt Abel and Terrence Brown, I'm curious what you think about them as the presumed starting backcourt for the Tar Heels heading into the year. Both guys that can have the ball in their hands and sort of serve as a key scoring option, specifically Terrence Brown, who's proven it over the last couple of seasons. But I'm curious how you think that's going to fit heading into the year. Because with Duke, you get Caleb Foster back, you get Caden Boozer back. I think Boozer, Foster, and Rippey are all sort of more floor general type point guards around a guy like John Blackwell, who's going to have the ball in his hands a lot. So I think it fits very well on paper, but I'm curious what you have to say about Carolina.
Yeah, I'm actually very excited to see how this backcourt unfolds. Again, a lot of moving parts coming into the program, so it's going to be a work in progress. I do think you'll see this team gel a lot through the non-conference portion of the schedule, and that'll be a very important stretch of time for North Carolina. But to answer your question, I think Nicholas Abdalas, I think he's going to operate as the primary point guard. And I think the fact that he's 6'9", 216 pounds, and he can play the point guard, he can run the offense, I do think that's a potential nightmare matchup for opposing defenses. And then Matt Abel, Terrence Brown, I think the thing about this backcourt that I'm most excited about is that it's just interchangeable. All these players can bring the ball off the court. All of them can play off the ball. And I think Terrence Brown, he's more of a slashing guard. He kind of struggled from 3-point range last season, shooting less than 33%. So I think he's going to be operating a lot off the ball, but I also think he's capable of bringing the ball up the court as well. And then Matt Abel, I think his potential was unrecognized at North Carolina State. Again, he averaged 8.8 points, 3.4 rebounds per game, but he only play 21 minutes off the bench, and he's going to be a key part of this rotation. And I think you're going to see him operate mostly on the wing. I know I said that the backcourt is interchangeable. I don't see him operating a lot at point guard. Again, there will be times maybe if he gets a defensive rebound, he is capable of bringing the ball up the court. But I'm actually very excited about this backcourt, and I do think it's going to end up being the strength of the North Carolina Tar Heels basketball program this season.
Yeah, you mentioned the strength. And so after Carolina brought in Cameron Fenns, I think just from a length perspective, how Duke and UNC matchup is very interesting because Duke might enter the year as the biggest, tallest, whatever you want to call it, team in the country. It's got 7'2" Joaquin Boomche down there, 7-footer Cameron Williams. You got 6'11" Pat Gungba. You got 6'9" Drew Sharnowski. There's a ton of size down low. And after bringing in Cameron Fenns from South Dakota, first team All Summit League selection, All Summit League defensive team selection, you got him at 7 feet. You got Alexander Samodurov, who's very long. You got Seyon Keita, who's not with the program yet, but is expected to be August at some point. And then you bring Jaron Stevenson back. So from a length perspective, I'm curious to see how these two teams match up, kind of because the front court's somewhat clogged, I think, for North Carolina. It's not necessarily complete, but there's a lot of pieces and I think a lot of question marks of who kind of fits where. I think Duke, at least to me, I kind of understand and see all these roles. For Carolina, not so much. I think the size and the length is there, but where those pieces go, I think there's a lot of question marks, kind of similar to the backcourt where I think you mentioned interchangeable, but this front court for me, just who plays the 4 and the 5, then who's kind of coming off the bench for significant minutes. I think there's a lot to be decided there, really, with how raw Seyon Keita is as a prospect.
Yeah, I think the 4 for me is pretty set in stone. I think Jaron Stevenson's going to be starting at the 4. That was one of Mike Malone's, key points this offseason was to keep Jaron Stevenson in Chapel Hill. At the 5, I think any 3 of these players could start. Again, Seyon Keita hasn't arrived to Chapel Hill yet, so I think the fact that he hasn't been here to work with the team, acclimate himself to the coaching staff, to the culture, I do think that's kind of put him behind the 8 ball, obviously. So I don't think he's going to end up starting. Before Cameron Fenns arrived, I would have projected Seyon Keita to start. I do think Cameron Fenns does end up starting just based on the fact that he has 4 years of experience in college basketball. Seyon Keita, Samodurov, Cade Betterman, who North Carolina brought in this offseason as a redshirt freshman from Northwestern, all have logged 0 minutes in college basketball. So I think Cameron Fenns, just his ability, just his experience, and he's been there, done that. He's productive. He's not going to offer a lot from the perimeter. So as you said, it's kind of like a jammed, front court. And I think you'll have to see Jaron Stevenson stretch the floor to a degree. His 3-point shooting will have to be very impactful and noticeable for that to work. But I do think Cameron Fenns, just like you said, Duke's front court, very elite. Louisville, we've seen what they've done this offseason in terms of player acquisition and bolstering that front court as well with Flory Badunga. I do think Cameron Fenns kind of fits more of, combating those front courts.
Yeah, well, again, Cameron Fenns, he has some limitations in space, but was a first-team All-Summit League or a Summit League defensive team selection. I think just how these two teams match up is going to be really interesting to watch next season because when you go by position to position, North Carolina has the pieces. I think they have the talent. It's just how it all fits. I think the fit on paper for Duke is there, and I think it's pretty clear when you break the roster down. I think for North Carolina, as it goes with a lot of head coaching changes. It's the same case kind of for Louisville in a way where it just how do these pieces fit. But breaking down position by position, you say Caleb Foster at point. We'll throw Matt Abel at the point just for now because for size purposes. And then at the 2, maybe John Blackwell and Terrence Brown. I think for 2 matchups a year, just how those 2 match up, I think that's very intriguing. And then down low, just the fact that UNC has the size to match up, at least on paper, with Duke, I think will be very intriguing to watch. But just going into what we're expecting this season, this is kind of where Duke and UNC differ, right? I mean, Duke is clearly entering with national title aspirations. Duke has fallen in heartbreak fashion in the NCAA tournament in 2 consecutive years, once in the Final Four to Houston in 2025, and then last season to UConn in the Elite Eight. I wouldn't necessarily say it's Final Four or bust for Duke. I think that's really hard to give any program that expectation before the season starts. But I do think this is Jon Scheyer's best chance to win. It's still hard to say that when the team hasn't played yet. But in terms of just rosters ready to win a championship, I think this is the best he's had. But, over in Carolina, he got back-to-back NCAA tournament exits. Logan, I'm curious what what does a successful season look like for Carolina? Because to me, for Duke, it's clear. Obviously, a successful season means a national title, but realistically speaking, for Duke, I think it's realistic to say a national title would consider a successful season. But what does that look like in year one under Michael Malone?
I think with year one under Michael Malone, as you stated, North Carolina's had first round exits in each of the last two NCAA tournaments. I think winning one game is bare minimum. I think a successful season would be reaching that second weekend and playing in the Sweet 16. And then everything on top of that would be icing on the cake. But I think it is unrealistic to expect North Carolina to contend for a national championship. I think it's going to be a tall task to get to an Elite Eight. But I think just reaching that second weekend, reaching the Sweet 16, just kind of gain your foot back in the door in terms of being one of those top tier blue blood programs. Because over the last 5 years under Hubert Davis, the majority of that time, North Carolina have really just been, just an afterthought because they went to the national championship in 2022, but in that year they were the 8th seed, and then they followed that next season with not even reaching the tournament altogether, and then a Sweet 16 appearance, and then they, the last 2 seasons first round exits. So I think under head coach Michael Malone in his first season, if you win 1 or 2 games, I think that would be a successful season. But from this perspective, I do think North Carolina reaching a Sweet 16 has to be one of the top goals for the program.
Now, you look at a program like Carolina. It's a blue blood program. Michael Malone knows this when he comes in as the head coach. He's back in college for the first time since 2001. The last time he was in college was as an assistant at Manhattan. But at a program like UNC, winning one game in the NCAA tournament simply isn't good enough. And even in a first year with a brand new roster, I'm still not sure it's good enough. He's coming into the season with the talent at his disposal. Again, it remains to be seen. I'm still not sure about the fit, but again, if Carolina wins a game in the tournament, that, it's progress. But I think Malone's in an interesting spot, just taking over a kind of blue blood job like this, just because that still isn't anywhere near what North Carolina expects to do. But to me, a second weekend appearance would be pretty successful. But say we get to March, we get to late March. Michael Malone, he wins one game. Carolina's out in, say, the round of 32. That is progress over the last few years. But what are we saying if Michael Malone, what are we saying over in Chapel Hill if he can't get to the second weekend, even though it's just year one?
Well, I think there's going to be major question marks heading into 2027 because this roster, I believe, is going to look vastly different after this upcoming season. I think, Terrence Brown, obviously a senior. I think Matt Abel and Nicholas Abdallas are each potential 2027 NBA draft prospects. And so I think the roster is going to look vastly different. And I think if North Carolina is eliminated in the round of 32, I certainly think it's not going to be, something that the fans are going to appreciate. And again, Michael Malone, there's a lot of expectations, fair or not, despite it being his first year. He really is not going to have the honeymoon phase because of what the program has gone through the last 2 seasons. Their fans and, their support want North Carolina to be challenging for, national titles in the near future. And I think if North Carolina wants that to be the case moving forward, they have to set the foundation this upcoming season by winning multiple games in the NCAA tournament. And so conference play is going to be significant for this team to set that foundation to get, to prove that they can be one of these top teams. And I've kind of, if you look at like recent bracket projections and all that, North Carolina's, projected 7, 8 seed, 6 seed. Obviously, that's not where the program wants to be. I think if North Carolina could, enter the tournament as a 5 or a 6 seed, I think they would take that all day. But again, I think North Carolina needs to win multiple games. So, like you said, a round 32 exit is progress technically, but still would feel like the program is at a stagnant point.
Yeah, I think heading to the ACC, North Carolina's in a really interesting spot because I wouldn't call you crazy if you put them somewhere as high as 4, maybe even 3 in some cases. I wouldn't think you crazy if you put them down at maybe 6 or 7. I think Duke and Virginia are the clear top 2 teams in the league heading into the season. Duke at number 1, Virginia number 2, but I'm really high on Virginia just because of the retention. But again, with Louisville at 3, it's a brand new roster. Just brought in Seth Trimble, former Tar Heel, 5th year. We'll see if this class-wide injunction holds up. But Seth Trimble out of Carolina after being a 4-year guard. And heading into the year, I've personally I've got Duke at 1, I've got Carolina at 5. I still have Miami at number 4. Jay Lucas was just extended. I think Miami is a real top 25 threat heading into the year, just within the ACC. Because for me, I've got Duke at 1, again Carolina at 5. I'm curious where you think North Carolina stacks up, relative to the rest of the league, because they're certainly in the top 5 in my opinion, but I think they're pretty interchangeable from that 3, 4, 5 slot.
Yeah, I think again it's going to come down to how this roster gels, especially in that non-conference portion of the schedule leading into conference play. I think their ceiling is as high as 3, and I know North Carolina finished as 4 last season, and injuries kind of played a part in that, specifically with Caleb Wilson. I think right now, realistically, they should be viewed as the 4th team, and I totally get where you're coming from as a 5th-ranked team. Again, Duke retaining most of their lineup, Virginia retaining a lot of their players. Louisville, we've seen what they've brought in this offseason, and Miami is also another intriguing team. So again, 3 through 5, I do think is pretty interchangeable, as you said. I think one with Duke is pretty much set in stone, barring any injuries or catastrophic, just ailments of those degrees. That's the only way I see Duke not finishing atop the ACC. I guess for me, like I said, I'd probably say 4 seed probably is most realistically for North Carolina. Is finishing 2nd, would that be a major disappointment for the Duke program if they finish behind a Louisville, behind a Virginia?
Absolutely, yeah. In my opinion, I mean, I'm really high on Virginia. 4 of the top 6 scores are back. Louisville, I'm just hesitant to get super high on with a roster completely compiled of all new transfers. I think they fit very well, but it's just hard to really project. I mean, Louisville, 3 of its top 4 scores last season were newcomers, and it ended in a 6th seed in the NCAA tournament. 24-11 overall record. But to me, yeah, I think Duke is clearly the best roster in the ACC heading into the season. Obviously, you can't project injuries or things of that nature, but I think Duke is everything it needs to win a national championship. I think the roster is the most talented in the ACC. I think it's the most complete. Duke has length. It has shooting on paper. It has obviously coaching. It has the backcourt. It has the depth. To me, yeah, considering what it's done the last 2 seasons, Duke has gone, again, we already mentioned at the top of the show, 36-2 in league play over the last 2 seasons. And granted, I think the ACC is in a much better place from a depth perspective than it's been in any of the last couple seasons. We do have an expanded tournament, obviously, but I think the ACC can get, 9 or 10 bids in a 76-team tournament. There's a couple teams that I think could make some noise, like a Syracuse that just aren't really getting much attention, or maybe a Clemson. But within the top 5, yeah, I think Duke is on its own tier. But for me, for sure, if Duke isn't running the ACC once again, I think more than probably 3 league losses would be a little bit of an alarm, of a bad signal. Can't think of the term off the top of my head here for some reason, but yeah, I think Duke is clearly the favorite in the ACC heading into the year. It's one of the favorites to win the national title. So I don't think Virginia is good enough to overtake Duke, considering the rest of the depth of the league in terms of the ACC crown alone. But yeah, I expect Duke to be the best team in the ACC. I expect it to be a top 3 in the sport, all health, expected. But I would say anything outside of 2 would be an utter disappointment for me, for the Blue Devils. And I think, going back to the rosters, I think before we get out of here would be a good way to close us off, because I've been talking about some potential kind of under the radar guys for Duke that I'm really high on heading into the year. A guy like Drew Sharnowski, a guy like Sebastian Wilkins. I considered Dame Sarr that, but I don't really anymore, because he's pretty quickly turning into one of the biggest breakout candidates in America. But again, on a roster so new, I'm curious what you have to say here, Logan. Who are some under the radar guys Tar Heel fans need to be watching for? Not necessarily the stars of the show, but guys that are going to play really important roles that maybe not everybody is talking about enough, whether they're a returner or a newcomer.
Yeah, for me, I'm really excited to see freshman Maximo Adams. Again, I think he was going to be a starter before Matt Abel signed with North Carolina, and he can score all 3 levels. He has the frame. He can create off the dribble. 6'7", 205-pound forward. I do think he's an X factor off the bench. I think he's going to play significant minutes. I think he's capable of averaging double-digit points off the bench, and I think he's going to be someone that North Carolina could rely on if the offense is sputtering, if they need kind of a boost off the bench. I am very excited to watch Maximo Adams. And then just another player, Kevin Thomas, who originally committed to LSU this offseason, decommitted, signed with North Carolina shortly after his visit. I think just his ability to play defense. Again, he's a very athletic wing. He's not going to offer much offensively, But I think just in terms of, defensive situationally, I think he is a great fit off the bench as well. And I was going to ask you, for Duke, what is your projected starting five if you had to project the starting lineup?
Yeah, I'll throw it back to you after I answer this because I'm curious to see what you have to say about that. For me, I mean, there's two kind of main position battles. To me, it's point guard and power forward. To me, Caleb Foster is the starter at point guard. It's either going to be Foster or Caden Boozer. I've had Caleb Foster in their all off season. I thought he was a bit of an underrated return for Duke just in terms of how impactful he is as a winner. The advanced metrics don't show it as much as I think they should. But I've got Caleb Foster at the point. Obviously, I've got John Blackwell at the shooting guard. I've talked enough about him. Got Dame Sarr at the three. I think he's going to turn into one of the best 3-and-D wings in the sport next season at 6'8". If that three-point volume improves. And then at the power forward, it's probably a competition between Joaquin Boomche and Cameron Williams, two incoming big-time recruits. For me, I've got Boomche in there. I think Cameron Williams is a little more raw, and I think a bench role for him, at least out of the gate, would be really beneficial. Joaquin Boomche has a proven outside shot. He's 7'2" and 250 pounds and has legitimate guard skills. I think he's very versatile. To me, he's 17 years old. He's going to be 17 for the entire season, 2026-27 season. But to me, I think he's done enough, at least from what I've seen this summer in the Next Gen EuroLeague tournament by Adidas and in the FIBA U17 World Cup for me to make sense, for me to put him into the starting lineup. And then obviously Patrick Gungba is the starting center at 6'11", the defensive anchor for this team. But I think if you took Duke's 6 to 10 guys and put it in the starting lineup, you could arguably have a top 25 team in the entire sport. So the depth is really there. Guys like Sebastian Wilkins, like Bryson Howard, like Deron Rippey, like Caden Boozer if he's coming off the bench, like Drew Sharnowski. So I like a lot of the depth. But I will throw that back to you because we mentioned it. The backcourt's very interchangeable. The front court has a lot of interesting pieces that we don't really know what role they're exactly going to play. So I'm curious if you had to kind of establish that today, where you would go with that too.
Yeah, for me, the backcourt's pretty straightforward with Matt Abel, Terrence Brown, Nicholas Abdallas. Again, I think all three players can play different roles along the wing or in the backcourt. I would probably say Nicholas Abdallas, just because he has that on-ball experience, I do think he's going to end up being the point guard. And then I'll have Terrence Brown at the two as a off-ball guard who can cut to the basket. A really athletic guard. I think that's something that really doesn't get, as advertised as much as it should. And then Matt Abel, I think, is just a do-it-all. Doesn't need to dribble the ball a lot. Doesn't need a lot of touches to score. And we kind of saw that at the NBA scouting combine earlier this offseason. His ability to make plays, score, even without the ball in his hands extensively. And then at the four, I think Jaren Stevenson, again, his second season in Chapel Hill, he brings that experience. And last season when Caleb Wilson went down, he averaged 10 points, 6 rebounds, shot 50% from the field. I do think that's difficult to replicate, but I think that kind of shows what he can accomplish in this type of role. And then at center, I think just because of experience, I do think Cameron Fentz is going to start at center. And I think having Sayan Keita and Alexandro Samdorov coming off the bench, I think it's fantastic for North Carolina to have those players, different skill sets, polar opposites in terms of what they're going to be able to do on the court. But having those two weapons off the bench, I think will serve North Carolina very well. So for me, the starting five would be Nicholas Abdallas, Terrence Brown, Matt Abel, Jaren Stevenson, and then Cameron Fentz from South Dakota.
4 newcomers in the projected starting lineup for North Carolina, at least 3 returners for the Blue Devils in that starting lineup. So very different there, different expectations, but Logan and I will be spending a lot more time discussing Duke football and UNC football throughout the regular season and previewing the basketball season for you guys here at the Duke Blue Devils Insider Podcast and the North Carolina Tar Heels Insider Podcast. Once again, we thank you all so much for watching, tuning in. Make sure to check us out at Duke on SI and UNC Tar Heels on SI every single day for your latest on both programs. If you're listening on YouTube, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe button. And if you're listening on any other platform, make sure to give us a rating down below. Once again, my name is Hugh Strain, your Duke on SI beat writer and host, alongside Logan Lazarchik, your UNC Tar Heels on SI beat writer and host. We will see you guys next time.